Everyone laughed when 26-year-old Anna Mitchell spent her last dollar on an abandoned theater everyone else wanted to tear down. They called her foolish. They said she was throwing her life away. But just days later, while repairing the old stage, Anna uncovered something no one had seen in nearly 70 years. It wasn't money, it wasn't treasure. It was a secret her grandfather had protected for decades. A secret that would restore a forgotten woman's name and change an entire town forever. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why one ordinary brass key brought so many people to tears. At 26, Anna Mitchell had already lived through more loss than most people faced in a lifetime. She never talked much about it. There wasn't anyone left who still remembered the little girl who once laughed so loudly that the neighbors could hear her through the open windows. Her parents were gone before she was old enough to understand why. After that, the only person she had was her grandfather. Robert Mitchell, a quiet man with weathered hands, kind eyes, and a lifetime spent repairing stages inside the old Avalon Grand Theater in the tiny Vermont town of Ashcroft. Robert used to tell her that every theater had two stages. One the audience can see, he'd say with a smile, and another hidden underneath, where the real stories are kept. As a little girl, Anna thought he was talking about magic. Years later, she realized he wasn't. She left college at 18 when Robert became too sick to work. While her friends built careers, married, and started families, Anna spent nearly 8 years helping an old man who apologized every day for becoming a burden. He never was. When Robert passed away during the first snowfall of November, Anna buried him with less than $300 in her bank account and nowhere left to call home. She slept in the back of an aging pickup truck behind St. Matthew's Church, taking whatever jobs she could find washing dishes, cleaning motel rooms, stocking shelves through the night. Most people passed by without ever learning her name. To the world, she was invisible. But before Robert died, he placed a small brass key in her hand. It was old, worn smooth by decades of use. Along with it came a faded photograph of the Avalon Grand Theater taken sometime in the late 1950s. On the back, in Robert's careful handwriting, were just 2 sentences. If you ever have the chance, don't let them tear it down. Everything I failed to protect is still waiting beneath the stage. Anna read those words hundreds of times. She never understood them. Until 6 weeks later, the town newspaper announced that the Avalon Grand Theater, a building abandoned for nearly 40 years, would be sold at public auction before demolition began. Everyone called it a money pit, a dangerous ruin, a place better forgotten. But as Anna stared at the photograph resting on her dashboard, she heard her grandfather's voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside her. The places the world forgets often hide the things that matter most. 3 days later, with every dollar she owned, a loan she had no idea how she would repay, and more faith than common sense, Anna Mitchell bought a broken theater. She had no way of knowing that hidden beneath its rotting wooden stage was a promise that had survived nearly 70 years. Or that keeping her grandfather's final wish would force her to uncover a truth powerful enough to change not only her own life, but the history of an entire nation. Anna didn't sleep the night she signed the papers. The keys to Avalon Grand Theater rested on the passenger seat of her old pickup. Tucked inside a plain white envelope, every few minutes, she found herself glancing toward them, almost expecting them to disappear if she looked away for too long. By sunrise, she was already driving toward the edge of Ashcroft. The narrow road curved through rows of aging maple trees dressed in the last colors of autumn. Morning fog drifted lazily across empty fields, softening the hills beyond. It reminded Anna of the quiet drives she used to take with her grandfather. Robert, on the way to his doctor's appointments. Neither of them had talked much during those trips. Sometimes love didn't need conversation. Sometimes simply being there was enough. Then she saw it. Avalon Grand Theater. Even after decades of abandonment, the old building still carried itself with quiet dignity. Its weathered brick facade hinted at a beauty that time had failed to erase. Broken stained glass windows caught the morning light like fractured jewels. Thick ivy wrapped itself around the tall columns, as though nature had been trying to shield the theater from a world that had long since forgotten it. Hannah parked across the street. For several minutes, she simply sat behind the wheel. She imagined Robert walking through those very front doors with his old toolbox hanging from one hand, greeting actors, carpenters, and musicians before another day's rehearsal began. A lump formed in her throat. "I hope I don't let you down, Grandpa," she whispered. The front doors groaned as she pushed them open. The smell reached her first. Dust, old timber, faded velvet, and something strangely familiar. The scent reminded her of forgotten photo albums stored in attics, memories quietly waiting for someone to open them again. Sunlight streamed through holes in the aging roof, falling across hundreds of empty theater seats covered in decades of dust. Torn crimson curtains hung above the stage without a hint of movement. Somewhere deep inside the building, water dripped steadily, marking the passing of time more faithfully than any clock ever could. Most people would have seen a ruin. Anna saw a life that had simply been left unfinished. She slowly walked down the center aisle. Robert had often told her stories about this place. Saturday nights when families lined up around the block. Children laughing during holiday performances. Young couples falling in love in the balcony seats. Veterans returning home from war, holding their wives' hands beneath the glowing chandeliers. Those stories felt impossibly distant now. The only audience left was silence. Anna climbed onto the stage. The old wooden floor groaned beneath her boots. Almost without thinking, she knelt and rested her hand against the worn planks. Robert's voice echoed in her memory. Stages remember every story ever told upon them. When she was a little girl, she thought he was simply being poetic. Standing there now, she wasn't so sure anymore. The days that followed became a rhythm of hard work and quiet determination. Every morning she swept years of dust from the lobby. She hauled broken furniture out to dumpsters. She boarded shattered windows before the Vermont winter could finish what neglect had started. At night, she climbed into the back of her old pickup truck parked behind the theater. Dinner was usually canned soup heated over a camping stove. Sometimes she was too exhausted even to finish eating before falling asleep beneath a pile of blankets. People noticed. Some slowed their cars just to stare. Others laughed. One afternoon, 2 construction workers pulled over beside the sidewalk. "You're the girl who bought Avalon," one of them asked. Anna smiled politely. "I am." The older man removed his cap. "Honey." He looked toward the theater for several long seconds before speaking again. "My father worked here." His voice carried no cruelty, only sadness. "I know what this place used to be." He sighed. "But some things aren't meant to come back." The truck rolled away. Anna watched it disappear down the road, wondering whether he was right. A few days later, another visitor appeared. She was an elderly woman wearing a navy blue coat and carrying a faded hatbox. "My name's Margaret Ellis," she said warmly. "I sold tickets here for 43 years. She smiled toward the lobby. "I thought someone ought to welcome you home." Inside the hatbox rested an old brass ticket punch, dozens of beautifully printed theater programs, and a tiny music box covered with scratches. Margaret carefully lifted it into Anna's hands. "It belonged to your grandfather." Anna blinked. "Grandpa Robert Margaret nodded. He left it behind one evening. She paused, then smiled gently. Or maybe he meant to. Anna slowly wound the tiny key. A delicate melody drifted through the empty theater. Soft, bittersweet, beautiful enough to make the silence itself feel alive. Margaret closed her eyes. Every morning before rehearsals, Robert would wind that little music box. He always said a theater deserved to wake up with music before it woke up with people. Neither woman spoke for a while. Finally, Margaret looked toward the stage. Did Robert ever tell you about the basement? Anna frowned. What basement? The older woman's expression changed immediately. He never told you. Anna shook her head. I didn't even know there was one. Margaret looked suddenly uncomfortable. I suppose. She hesitated. Perhaps he had his reasons. Before leaving, she stopped at the front doors. If anyone comes asking to buy this place, she looked Anna directly in the eyes. Don't answer too quickly. Then she walked away. Anna remained standing in the lobby long after the music had faded. A basement. Robert had never once mentioned a basement. Not once. 3 days later, the first offer arrived. A black luxury SUV rolled into the theater parking lot. A sharply dressed man stepped out carrying a leather briefcase. His smile looked practiced. My name is Victor Langley. I represent Hawthorne Development. Anna invited him inside. He barely glanced around before placing a folder on the dusty stage. This building clearly means something to you. He spoke calmly. It doesn't mean anything to us. We're prepared to offer you $800,000. Anna stared at him. $800,000. More money than she had ever imagined having. Victor continued. You could buy a home, go back to college, travel, start your life over. No more sleeping in your truck. No more wondering how you'll survive next month. He slid a pen across the folder. All you have to do is sign. Anna looked out across the empty seats. In her mind, she could almost picture Robert sitting quietly in the front row, watching, waiting. She slipped her hand into her jacket pocket until her fingers wrapped around the old brass key. His final words echoed inside her heart. Don't let them tear it down. Slowly, she pushed the contract back across the table. I'm sorry. I'm not selling. Victor's smile vanished. He calmly gathered the paperwork. As he reached the exit, he stopped without turning around. You know, our company already owns nearly every property on this block. His voice became colder. People usually discover that saying no today doesn't always mean they'll be able to say no tomorrow. Then he left. That night, the wind howled through the broken windows of Avalon. Anna lay awake in the back of her truck, replaying the conversation again and again. Just after midnight, a deafening crash shattered the silence. She grabbed her flashlight and ran toward the theater. One of the side doors had been forced open. Inside, muddy footprints stretched across the dusty lobby. Nothing appeared to be missing. Nothing had been vandalized, except one thing: the center of the stage. Several wooden floorboards had been pried loose. As Anna knelt to inspect the damage, her flashlight caught the dull reflection of something hidden beneath the boards. A brass lock, almost completely concealed beneath the floor. Her heartbeat quickened. Slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out Robert Mitchell's weathered key. She stared at it for several long seconds, because deep inside, before she had even tried, she already knew it was going to fit. For several long moments, Anna simply knelt there, the old brass key resting in her trembling hand. The silence inside Avalon felt different now. It no longer felt abandoned. It felt as though the building itself had been waiting. She slid the key into the hidden lock. It fit perfectly. Not almost. Not close enough. Perfectly. Anna closed her eyes for a second before turning it. The mechanism resisted at first, protesting after decades without movement. Then came a heavy metallic click that echoed beneath the stage. A deep sound. Ancient. Almost relieved. The section of wooden flooring shifted ever so slightly. Cold air escaped through the narrow opening, carrying with it the scent of damp stone, old paper, and something strangely metallic. Anna pulled the loose boards aside one by one until a square iron hatch appeared beneath them. Its surface was coated in rust. Across the center, barely visible beneath years of grime, someone had engraved a single sentence. "Some promises are worth hiding for." Her throat tightened. Robert. It sounded exactly like something he would say. She wrapped both hands around the heavy iron ring and pulled. The hatch refused to move. She pulled again. Nothing. Finally, she found an old crowbar backstage and wedged it beneath the edge. With one final effort, the seal finally broke. A cloud of stale air rose from the darkness below. Stone steps disappeared into the earth. Anna aimed her flashlight downward. The beam seemed almost swallowed by the darkness. For a moment, every instinct told her to call someone. The police. The Historical Society. Anyone. Instead, she heard Robert's voice inside her memory. Sometimes the first person who discovers a story becomes responsible for protecting it. Taking a slow breath, Anna stepped onto the first stair. Each wooden step groaned beneath her weight. Dust floated through the flashlight beam like tiny ghosts disturbed from a decades-long sleep. At the bottom, she found herself standing inside a narrow corridor built from rough-cut granite. The walls weren't part of the original theater. They were older, much older. Someone had spent an extraordinary amount of time hiding this place. The corridor opened into a surprisingly large underground room. Anna slowly turned in a circle. Shelves lined every wall. Thousands of handwritten pages sat neatly stacked inside weathered wooden boxes. Leather-bound journals. Rolled blueprints tied with faded ribbon. Photographs. Letters. Metal filing cabinets whose drawers had rusted shut. Nothing looked abandoned. Everything looked carefully preserved, as though someone had expected another pair of hands to one day continue where they had left off. Anna stepped toward the nearest desk. A thick layer of dust covered its surface. She brushed it away gently. Beneath the dust rested an old leather notebook. Inside the front cover was a name written in graceful handwriting. Dr. Eleanor Hayes. Below the name appeared a date. March 17th, 1934. Anna had never heard it before. She flipped through several pages. Most contained mathematical sketches she couldn't begin to understand. Others were filled with personal reflections. One sentence caught her attention. History has always been kind to powerful men. It has rarely been kind to women who dared to build something greater. Anna frowned. Who was this woman? She continued searching. Another journal. Another. Soon she realized there were dozens, perhaps hundreds. Some contained photographs of Eleanor standing beside groups of engineers. Others showed her speaking in lecture halls, smiling beside enormous chalkboards covered with equations. She looked confident, respected, important, yet somehow Anna had never heard her name. That seemed impossible. An entire lifetime of work hidden beneath an abandoned theater. She carefully placed the journals back exactly where she had found them. Then something else caught her eye. At the far end of the room stood a brick wall unlike the others. Newer, smoother. as though someone had built it long after the underground archive already existed. One of the bricks reflected the flashlight differently, almost polished. Anna walked closer. Her fingers brushed across the surface. The brick shifted inward with a quiet click. A hidden latch. Slowly, almost silently, part of the wall began sliding sideways. A second chamber revealed itself beyond. The air inside felt noticeably colder. Anna's flashlight swept across the room, then stopped. She forgot how to breathe. Occupying nearly the entire chamber stood an enormous machine, unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't beautiful, but it possessed a strange kind of majesty. Copper coils wound around polished steel cylinders. Glass tubes stretched between brass fittings. Hundreds of carefully labeled gauges covered the front panel. Every component had been assembled by hand with astonishing precision. No rust covered the polished metal. No corrosion marked the wiring. It looked maintained, impossible. No one had entered this room for decades. Had they? Anna stepped closer. At the center of the machine rested a bronze nameplate. She brushed away years of dust. The engraving slowly appeared. Project Lumina, designed by Dr. Eleanor Hayes. Completed. October 11th, 1938. Anna whispered the words aloud. Project Lumina. She had absolutely no idea what she was looking at. Yet one thing became immediately clear. This wasn't theater equipment. This wasn't a stage prop. Whatever Eleanor Hayes had built, she had intended it to change something. Everything inside the room seemed frozen in the exact position it had been left. Coffee cup, reading glasses, a wrench lying beside an unfinished notebook. It looked less like an abandoned laboratory, and more like someone had walked away planning to return the next morning. Anna opened the notebook. The final entry stopped her cold. If this room is ever opened, then Robert kept his promise. She stared at the words. Her heart began pounding. Robert. Her grandfather. She read the sentence again. There was no mistake. The notebook continued. If you're reading this, then the world has probably forgotten my name. That doesn't matter. What matters is that the work survived. Trust Robert. If he believed you were ready, then I believe him too. Anna slowly lowered the notebook. None of this made sense. Robert had never spoken about Eleanor Hayes, never mentioned a laboratory, never hinted that he knew anything hidden beneath Avalon. Yet somehow, this woman had known him, trusted him, entrusted him with something so important that he had protected it for the rest of his life. Tears welled in Anna's eyes. Suddenly she understood why Robert had refused to let Avalon be demolished. It had never been about saving an old theater. The theater had simply been the lock. Whatever lay hidden beneath it, that had always been the treasure. Anna looked once more at the massive machine standing silently before her. Questions flooded her mind. What did it do? Why had it been hidden? Who wanted it forgotten? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, if Robert had guarded this secret for nearly 70 years, who else knew it was here? At that exact moment, far above the underground chambers, Anna heard something. A floorboard creaked, then another. Someone was walking across the stage above her. Anna didn't move. The footsteps above her were slow, measured. Whoever was walking across the stage wasn't wandering. They sounded deliberate. She switched off her flashlight. The underground chamber disappeared into complete darkness. For several long seconds, she simply listened. One step, another, a pause. Then the unmistakable scrape of wood sliding across wood. Someone was examining the stage. the very place where she had uncovered the hidden hatch. Anna's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She held her breath. The footsteps lingered for another minute before gradually fading toward the lobby. A heavy door opened, then closed. Silence returned. Only then did Anna dare switch the flashlight back on. She looked toward Eleanor Hayes's final notebook again. Trust Robert. Those two words carried a different weight now. Robert hadn't stumbled upon this place by accident. He had been chosen, which meant everything he had ever told Anna about Avalon had been carefully measured. Every story, every lesson, every strange sentence that never quite made sense. They weren't bedtime stories. They were clues. Anna climbed back upstairs just as dawn began to soften the sky. She locked the hatch exactly as she had found it and carefully replaced every loose floorboard. If someone had been searching during the night, they couldn't know she had already found the entrance. Not yet. She spent the morning pretending to clean the theater while her thoughts raced faster than she could organize them. Who was Eleanor Hayes? Why had Robert protected her work? And perhaps most importantly, who had been inside Avalon only hours earlier? By lunchtime, she knew one thing. She needed answers. Real answers, not guesses. The Ashcroft Public Library occupied one corner of the old town square, inside a stone building that hadn't changed much since the 1940s. The librarian, Mrs. Eleanor Dawson, smiled warmly when Anna walked inside. "You must be the young woman who bought Avalon." News traveled fast in Ashcroft. Anna smiled politely. "I was hoping to learn a little about its history." Mrs. Dawson's expression softened. "Oh, that building has more stories than most people around here." For nearly 3 hours, Anna searched through newspaper archives, property records, and local history books. She found photographs of Avalon during its glory years, articles about Broadway tours, holiday concerts, fundraisers during World War II, even advertisements showing lines of smiling families stretching around the block. But one name never appeared: Eleanor Hayes. Not once. It was as though she had never existed. Anna finally approached Mrs. Dawson again. "Have you ever heard of a scientist named Eleanor Hayes?" The librarian stopped shelving books. For just a fraction of a second, it was barely noticeable. But Anna saw it. Recognition, followed immediately by hesitation. Mrs. Dawson lowered her voice. "My grandfather mentioned that name once." "What did he say?" "He told me there were certain people this town stopped talking about." Anna waited. Mrs. Dawson looked toward the empty reading room before continuing. "They said Eleanor embarrassed powerful men. After that, she disappeared from every conversation." Anna frowned. "Disappeared." The older woman nodded slowly. "Not physically. Historically." That evening, Anna drove 30 miles to Burlington. There was only one person she could think of: Professor Arthur Bennett, a retired historian whose books focused on forgotten inventors and overlooked scientific discoveries. She wasn't expecting him to answer. Yet, when she knocked on the door of his small farmhouse, an elderly man with silver hair opened it almost immediately. He looked as though he had been expecting company. "I'm Arthur Bennett." Anna introduced herself. The moment she mentioned Eleanor Hayes, everything changed. The old professor fell completely silent. His eyes widened. "Where did you hear that name?" Anna hesitated. I think I found something that belonged to her." Arthur stared at her for several long seconds. Finally, he stepped aside. "You'd better come in." His study looked less like a home office and more like a museum. Shelves overflowed with biographies, engineering journals, and handwritten notes. Old photographs covered the walls. Arthur disappeared into another room before returning with a worn cardboard box. "I've spent 32 years researching Eleanor Hayes." He smiled sadly. "And this," he gently opened the box, "is everything history allowed me to find." The contents shocked Anna. Less than 20 documents. A handful of newspaper clippings. One blurred photograph. A university graduation announcement. That was all. "That's impossible," Anna whispered. "There are hundreds of journals." Arthur looked up sharply. Hundreds. Anna immediately realized what she had almost revealed. She changed the subject. "I mean, if she accomplished so much, why is there almost nothing left?" Arthur leaned back in his chair. "Because someone made sure there wouldn't be." He carefully unfolded the old newspaper clipping. Officially, Eleanor retired from scientific research in 1939. He looked directly at Anna. "I've never believed that." "What do you believe?" "I believe her work frightened someone." Arthur walked toward an old filing cabinet and removed another folder. Inside were patent records, engineering journals, corporate histories. He pointed to one familiar name, Hawthorne Industries. Anna's stomach tightened. "The same Hawthorne?" Arthur nodded. "The very same," he continued quietly. "Hawthorne became one of America's largest energy companies after the Second World War. Their founder, Charles Hawthorne, received several groundbreaking patents during the late 1930s. He slid one patent across the desk. Anna stared at the technical drawing. Something about it looked strangely familiar, not identical. But close, very close. Arthur noticed her reaction. "You've seen something like it." It wasn't a question. Anna didn't answer. Arthur smiled gently. "I've spent decades believing Eleanor Hayes built something extraordinary. But belief isn't evidence." He sighed. "I've never found proof." Anna thought about the underground laboratory. The journals. The machine. Robert's name inside Eleanor's notebook. She wanted desperately to tell him everything. Instead, she asked a different question. If someone really wanted to erase a person's work, could they? Arthur laughed quietly. "It happens more often than people realize." He looked toward the window. History remembers winners. It doesn't always remember the people they defeated. Anna drove back to Ashcroft long after sunset. For the first time since discovering the laboratory, her fear had begun changing into something else. Responsibility. She no longer believed she had accidentally uncovered an old scientific archive. She believed Robert had spent decades protecting evidence. Evidence someone else had worked very hard to erase. When she parked behind Avalon, she noticed fresh tire tracks near the loading entrance. They hadn't been there that morning. Someone had returned. She quietly entered through the rear door. Everything looked normal. Until she reached the stage. One floorboard, barely noticeable, had been moved less than half an inch. Not enough for anyone else to notice. Just enough for someone searching. Anna looked down at the old brass key resting in her hand. Then back toward the darkness beneath the stage. She finally understood something her grandfather had tried to teach her all those years. He hadn't asked her to save an old theater. He had asked her to protect the truth. And for the first time since buying Avalon, Anna realized she wasn't simply restoring a forgotten building. She had inherited a promise, one that someone else was still trying to destroy. Anna barely slept that night. She sat alone in the front row of Avalon, wrapped in an old blanket, watching moonlight spill through the broken stained glass windows. The theater no longer felt empty, it felt alive. Every creak in the old beams, every whisper of wind through cracked glass, every shadow stretching across the stage, It all felt like pieces of a story waiting patiently to be told. She finally understood why Robert had spent nearly 40 years refusing better-paying jobs in neighboring towns. People assumed he had stayed because he loved the theater. Now she knew the truth. He had stayed because he had made a promise. And somehow, that promise now belonged to her. The following morning, Anna returned underground carrying boxes, notebooks, a camera, and a portable scanner she had borrowed from the library. If Eleanor Hayes had trusted Robert, then Anna intended to honor that trust. She began carefully documenting everything. Every journal, every blueprint, every photograph, every handwritten note. Nothing left the underground chamber. Instead, she photographed each page exactly where it had rested for decades. She knew enough from watching documentaries to understand one thing. Once evidence was moved, people could question it. But if everything remained untouched, the truth became much harder to deny. Hours slipped by unnoticed. One journal described Eleanor's childhood fascination with electricity. Another recorded her years studying engineering at a time when women were rarely welcomed into laboratories. Anna found letters filled with rejection. University boards telling Eleanor to leave scientific research to men. Investors refusing to fund her ideas. Government officials dismissing her work without ever reading it. Yet, page after page, Eleanor never sounded bitter, only determined. One sentence caught Anna's attention. Truth doesn't disappear because people refuse to believe it. Sometimes it simply waits for kinder generations. Anna quietly copied those words into her own notebook. Late that afternoon, Professor Arthur Bennett arrived at Avalon. Anna hadn't invited him. She had simply called the night before and asked whether he would be willing to look at something important. The old historian stepped inside carrying a worn leather satchel. "I wasn't sure you'd actually call." Anna smiled nervously. "I wasn't sure you'd believe me." She led him onto the stage. Neither of them spoke. Slowly, Anna removed the loose floorboards. Arthur watched silently. When she unlocked the hidden hatch, his breathing changed. He didn't say a single word until they reached the underground archive. Then he stopped walking altogether. "My God!" His voice barely rose above a whisper. For several long moments he simply turned in slow circles, taking everything in. The journals, the shelves, the blueprints, the photographs, the hidden laboratory beyond the stone wall. Finally, tears gathered in the corners of his eyes. "I've spent half my life searching for this woman." He gently rested one hand against a shelf of journals. "And she was here all along." Anna quietly watched him. Arthur wasn't looking at forgotten documents. He was looking at 30 years of unanswered questions finally receiving an answer. When they entered the second chamber, Arthur froze again. The enormous machine stood exactly as Anna had left it, silent, patient, almost majestic. He approached slowly, not like a scientist, like a man entering a cathedral. He examined the polished brass fittings, the copper coils, the intricate wiring. Every few seconds he shook his head in disbelief. "This," he swallowed, "shouldn't exist." Anna looked at him. "What is it?" Arthur smiled sadly. "I honestly don't know." He laughed softly. "And that's what frightens me." He pointed toward several unusual components. Some of these engineering principles weren't supposed to appear until decades later. He turned toward Anna. If Eleanor Hayes built this in the 1930s, history has been missing an entire chapter. For the next 3 days, they worked together underground. Arthur cataloged historical records. Anna photographed every document. Together, they slowly assembled pieces of Eleanor's life. The picture that emerged was heartbreaking. She hadn't been an assistant. She hadn't been someone else's student. She had led her own research, filed her own patents, designed every blueprint herself. Then, almost overnight, her name disappeared. The patents remained. The discoveries remained. Even the technology continued evolving. Only Eleanor herself had vanished from the story. Arthur leaned back in his chair one evening, exhausted. "I've seen this before." Anna looked up. "What do you mean?" "History rarely erases ideas." He sighed. "It erases people." Meanwhile, life above ground continued becoming more complicated. Every other day, another representative from Hawthorne Development appeared. Each offer grew larger. $1 million, 1.5, then $2 million. The amount no longer made sense. No abandoned theater was worth that kind of money. Unless they weren't buying the theater. They were buying what lay beneath it. That realization settled heavily over Anna. Someone knew. Maybe not everything, but enough. A week later, another surprise arrived. Margaret Ellis returned, carrying an old wooden crate she had discovered in her attic. "I almost threw this away years ago." She smiled apologetically. "I think it belongs here." Inside were dozens of theater photographs, programs, employee records, and a small envelope addressed simply, "Robert Mitchell." Anna carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting wasn't Robert's. It belonged to Eleanor. "Dear Robert, if you're reading this, then I've finally accepted what you tried so hard to convince me of. Some inventions are simply born before the world deserves them. If anything happens to me, promise me one thing. Don't protect my machine. Protect the truth. Machines can always be rebuilt. A stolen life never can." Anna stopped reading. Her vision blurred with tears. Robert hadn't spent his life protecting a machine. He had spent it protecting a woman's name. A woman history had almost erased forever. Suddenly, everything about her grandfather made sense. His quiet humility. His refusal to seek recognition. His constant reminders that doing the right thing rarely earned applause. He had never been guarding a secret because it was valuable. He had been guarding it because it was right. That evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the Vermont hills, Anna and Arthur sat together on the edge of the old stage. Neither spoke for a long while. Finally, Arthur broke the silence. "You know what happens if we tell the world." Anna nodded slowly. "People will come. They will. Scientists, lawyers, journalists, collectors, and people who will want to own it." Anna looked toward the empty auditorium. "This theater has been silent for 40 years. She smiled faintly. "Maybe. It's finally time someone heard its story." Arthur smiled. "For the first time in decades, I think history is about to correct one of its greatest mistakes." Anna reached into her pocket and wrapped her fingers around Robert Mitchell's brass key. She no longer saw it as the key to a hidden room. It had become something far more meaningful. It was the key to a promise, and promises were meant to be kept. She didn't yet know how difficult that promise would become. She didn't know how many people would soon try to stop her, or how much she would have to sacrifice to tell Eleanor Hayes's story. But one thing had become perfectly clear. Anna Mitchell had not inherited a forgotten theater. She had inherited a mission, and for the first time since losing her grandfather, she no longer felt alone. The story spread far more quickly than Anna had imagined. Professor Arthur Bennett hadn't contacted television stations. He hadn't called newspaper reporters. Instead, he quietly shared several verified documents with 3 respected historians he had trusted for decades. He believed the truth deserved careful hands before loud voices. But truth has a strange way of finding daylight. Within a week, whispers about a forgotten female inventor hidden beneath an abandoned Vermont theater had begun circulating through academic circles. Then someone leaked a photograph. It wasn't the machine. It wasn't the underground laboratory. It was one page from Eleanor Hayes' journal. Only one sentence appeared. History has always been kind to powerful men. It has rarely been kind to women who dared to build something greater. The photograph spread across social media faster than anyone expected. Soon came the questions. Who was Eleanor Hayes? Was she real? What had she built? And why had no one ever heard her name? For the first time in nearly a century, people were asking exactly the questions Eleanor had hoped someone would ask. Not everyone celebrated. A week later, Anna found a plain white envelope pushed beneath the front door of Avalon. No stamp, no return address. Inside was a single typed sentence. Walk away while you still can. Nothing else. No signature. No explanation. Arthur examined the letter quietly. They're frightened. Anna looked at him. You really think so? He nodded. People don't threaten fairy tales. They threaten evidence. Anna folded the paper carefully and placed it inside one of Eleanor's empty archive boxes. She wasn't going to pretend the warning didn't scare her. It did, but fear no longer carried the same weight it once had. She had already lost everyone she loved. There wasn't much left the world could take from her. 3 days later, Hawthorne Development returned. This time, Victor Langley wasn't smiling. He walked across the stage as though he already owned it. Our board has approved a final offer. He placed another folder on the ticket counter. $5 million. Anna stared at the number. $5 million? Enough money to buy a home, finish school, travel the world, never worry about another meal, never sleep in a truck again. Victor spoke softly. This is more than generosity. It's an opportunity. Anna remained silent. You don't owe this building your future. He leaned slightly closer. Robert Mitchell made his choices. You don't have to spend your life making the same mistakes. The words struck harder than Victor realized. For just a moment, Anna imagined saying yes. A small house with a front porch, a warm bed, a life that didn't begin every morning wondering what might go wrong. She had dreamed about that life since she was a little girl. Victor noticed the hesitation. You're tired. I can see it. You've spent your whole life surviving. Don't mistake survival for purpose. He slid the contract toward her. Sign. Anna lowered her eyes. Then she slowly reached into her coat pocket. Not for a pen. For Robert's brass key. She placed it quietly on top of the contract. I spent 8 years taking care of my grandfather. My friends thought I wasted my 20s. She smiled sadly. But I never regretted a single day. She looked Victor directly in the eye. And I'm not going to regret this one either. She handed the contract back. I'm still not selling. Victor stared at her for several seconds before gathering his papers. You remind me of someone. Anna frowned. Eleanor Hayes. Without another word, he walked away. Those 4 words stayed with Anna long after his car disappeared. How did he know Eleanor's name? That evening, Arthur arrived, carrying several engineering professors from the University of Vermont. Anna had agreed to let them examine the laboratory. Not the machine. Not yet. Only the journals and historical records. She wanted independent experts to confirm everything before making any public announcement. The professors spent hours studying Eleanor's notebooks. None of them questioned whether she had written them. The handwriting matched. The dates matched. The mathematics were astonishing. Late that night, one of the engineers quietly approached Anna. I've taught electrical engineering for 31 years. He paused. I don't understand half of what this woman was thinking. He laughed softly. And that's the highest compliment I know how to give. Over the following weeks, something remarkable began happening. Retired electricians volunteered to repair Avalon free of charge. Former actors offered to restore the stage. Carpenters rebuilt broken seats. A local bakery delivered sandwiches every Saturday. High school students cleaned windows. No one asked for payment. No one expected recognition. Some had known Robert. Others simply believed that if one forgotten woman deserved to have her story told, then perhaps they all had a responsibility to help. The theater slowly began breathing again. For the first time in 40 years, music echoed through its halls. Not from performances, from people working together. Anna often stopped what she was doing just to listen. The sound reminded her of childhood, of Robert whistling while fixing lights high above the stage. She smiled every time. One rainy afternoon, while organizing another cabinet beneath the theater, Anna discovered a sealed wooden box hidden behind a loose stone. Inside rested Robert Mitchell's personal journal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The first page read simply, "If Anna is reading this, then I suppose I finally kept my promise long enough." Tears blurred her vision before she reached the second sentence. Robert described the day he had first met Eleanor Hayes. He had been just 19 years old, a stage mechanic trying to earn enough money to support his widowed mother. One evening, he accidentally discovered Eleanor working beneath the theater after everyone else had gone home. She hadn't chased him away. Instead, she had asked for help moving equipment. One night became two. Two became years. Eventually, Robert became the only person Eleanor trusted completely. Not because he understood her science, but because he never laughed at her dreams. Anna quietly wiped tears from her face. Her grandfather hadn't been a famous scientist. He hadn't changed history with brilliant inventions. He had changed history by believing in someone when no one else would. Perhaps that required even greater courage. As she closed the journal, Anna looked around the underground chamber. For months, she had believed her responsibility was protecting Eleanor's machine. Now she understood how wrong she had been. The machine mattered, but it wasn't the heart of the story. The heart of the story was Eleanor, a woman who refused to surrender her brilliance, and Robert, a man ordinary enough to be overlooked by history, yet extraordinary enough to spend nearly half a century protecting someone else's legacy without ever asking for credit. Anna smiled through tears. For the first time since she had lost her grandfather, she no longer felt like a homeless young woman trying to save an abandoned theater. She felt like the next guardian of a promise. And some promises are worth giving your entire life to keep. Winter gave way to spring. Almost without anyone noticing, the snow that had blanketed the streets of Ashcroft slowly melted into narrow streams that ran alongside the old sidewalks. Buds returned to the maple trees surrounding Avalon Grand Theater, and for the first time in decades, people no longer walked past the building without looking. They stopped. Some simply stood across the street in silence. Others smiled. Many remembered. The old theater no longer looked abandoned. It looked alive. Fresh paint covered the weathered doors. Every broken window had been carefully restored using the original stained glass designs. Volunteers had repaired the velvet curtains by hand, refusing to replace them because, as one retired seamstress put it, some wrinkles deserve to stay. They remind us we've lived. Anna smiled every time she heard that, because she understood exactly what the woman meant. Months of research had finally reached their conclusion. Independent historians confirmed Eleanor Hayes's authorship of the journals. Engineers authenticated the laboratory. Archivists verified the dates of every notebook, every blueprint, every letter. The evidence was overwhelming. A woman history had nearly erased had, at last, found her voice again. News organizations from across the country came to Ashcroft. They expected to interview a young woman who had uncovered a scientific mystery. Instead, they found a story about loyalty, about promises, about two ordinary people who refused to let the truth disappear. Anna insisted that every interview begin the same way. "This story doesn't belong to me. It belongs to Eleanor Hayes and to my grandfather, Robert Mitchell. He spent most of his life protecting something the world never thanked him for. I think it's finally time someone did." Those words appeared in newspapers across America. They resonated far beyond Vermont. Thousands of letters began arriving at Avalon. Some came from retired teachers, others from veterans, factory workers, widows, grandchildren. Many wrote about someone in their own family who had been forgotten, overlooked, or never given credit for what they had done. Without realizing it, Anna had awakened something much larger than an old mystery. She had reminded people that history isn't only written by famous names. Sometimes it's quietly protected by ordinary hearts. Several months later, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the National Museum of American Innovation. Inside was an invitation. A special ceremony would be held to recognize the long-overlooked contributions of Dr. Eleanor Hayes to American scientific history. The museum also wished to honor one other person, Robert Mitchell, not as an inventor, not as a scientist, but as the man whose quiet integrity had preserved the evidence long enough for justice to find it. Anna sat in the empty theater holding the letter for a long time. She wished more than anything that Robert could have seen it. Then she smiled. Maybe, in some way, he already had. The ceremony took place on a warm afternoon in early May. Historians, engineers, students, reporters, and families filled the auditorium. At the center of the stage stood two bronze plaques. One read, "Dr. Eleanor Hayes," a visionary whose brilliance waited patiently for history to catch up. The second was much simpler, "Robert Mitchell." He asked for no recognition. He simply kept his promise. Anna stood backstage holding the speech she had rewritten at least 20 times. When her name was announced, she walked slowly toward the podium. Halfway there, she stopped, folded the speech, and slipped it back into her pocket. Some stories were never meant to be read, only spoken from the heart. She looked across the audience. I've been told many times over the past year that I saved a theater. She smiled gently. But that's not true. The theater saved me. The room fell completely silent. When I bought Avalon, I thought I was giving an old building a second chance. It turns out, it was giving one to me. She paused as emotion caught in her voice. My grandfather spent 40 years protecting a woman he believed the world had treated unfairly. He never expected applause. He never expected anyone to know. He simply believed that doing the right thing mattered, even if no one was watching. Anna looked toward Robert's plaque. I used to think courage meant doing something extraordinary. I know better now. Courage is keeping a promise when the person you made it to is no longer here to remind you. Many in the audience quietly wiped away tears. Anna continued. Eleanor Hayes changed history with her mind. My grandfather changed history with his character. And if there's anything this journey has taught me, it's that the world needs both. The audience rose together. Not because of a scientific discovery, not because of headlines, but because they recognized something deeply human, the quiet power of an ordinary life lived with extraordinary faithfulness. That evening, Anna returned to Avalon. The theater was empty once more. just the way Robert had always loved it after everyone else had gone home. She walked onto the stage carrying two things: his old brass key and the tiny music box Margaret Ellis had returned months before. She wound it slowly. The familiar melody drifted through the auditorium, exactly as it had every morning when Robert arrived for work. Hannah walked to the front row. Seat A1. The seat Robert had always chosen whenever rehearsals ended. She gently placed the brass key there, not because she no longer needed it, but because she finally understood what it had unlocked. It had never been a door beneath the stage. It had opened something inside her, a belief that kindness matters, that promises matter, that ordinary people, living quiet lives, can become guardians of truths far greater than themselves. She looked toward the restored stage. The lights slowly brightened overhead. Children's laughter echoed from the lobby as the first community theater rehearsal in 40 years prepared to begin. Hannah smiled. "Welcome home, Grandpa," for just a moment, as the music box played softly in the quiet theater. She could almost imagine Robert standing backstage with his old toolbox in one hand, smiling the same gentle smile she had known all her life. And somehow, that was enough, because Avalon was no longer a forgotten theater. Eleanor Hayes was no longer a forgotten name, and Robert Mitchell was no longer a forgotten man. Their stories would live on not because they had sought greatness, but because they had chosen honesty, compassion, and quiet courage when no one was looking. Sometimes, that is the kind of legacy that lasts the longest. A few weeks later, Avalon Grand Theater was alive again, not because famous performers had returned, but because children had. Every Saturday morning, the old stage echoed with music, laughter, and dreams that finally had a place to grow. One afternoon, after rehearsal, a little girl walked up to Anna holding a notebook. Miss Anna. Who was Robert Mitchell? Anna looked toward the front row, where her grandfather's photograph quietly rested beneath the warm glow of a single light. She smiled. He wasn't famous. He never invented anything. He was simply a man who refused to let a good person be forgotten. The little girl thought for a moment. So, he changed history. Anna nodded gently. Yes, but not because people remembered his name, because he made sure they remembered hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Anna reached into her pocket and held the old brass key one last time. The key that had opened more than a hidden room. It had opened the truth. She placed it inside a small wooden display beside Eleanor Hayes' journals, where anyone who visited Avalon could see it. A simple brass key, a lifetime of quiet courage. As the lights dimmed, children's laughter echoed through the theater once again. Anna looked toward the empty front row and whispered, "We kept our promise, Grandpa. Some people leave behind fortunes. Others leave behind buildings. But the greatest among us leave something far more lasting. The courage to protect the truth, and the kindness to make sure someone else is never forgotten."